Now, to many people, Nelson Mandela is a hero, the founding father of South Africa. This guy is celebrated across the world as the man who defeated apartheid, but to some, he was a complete sellout. A leader who gained his fame at the expense of his wife, Winnie Mandela. So, why did many consider Winnie the hero and Nelson Mandela the sellout? I'm going to have to take you through Winnie Mandela's story so that you can be able to understand this woman. Winnie Madikizela-Mandela was the mother of the nation, and we cannot deny that some also saw her as a symbol of betrayal. She was Nelson Mandela's wife, his fiercest defender, the woman who carried his name through 27 years of silence. But she was also the woman tied to the murder of a 14-year-old boy, the woman accused of love affairs while Mandela waited for her in prison, the woman whose name was left out of Mandela's will even after all she had endured. She spent months in solitary confinement, so lonely, some people say she spoke to cockroaches just to keep her sanity. She was banished to a crumbling house in a dusty town, and yet there she built schools and clinics. She walked behind the coffins of children shot in Soweto. And when the world called for patience, this woman called for fire. When Mandela finally walked free, it was her hand he held. But when he died, it was Graça Machel who inherited his estate. And yet, here is the truth no one can deny. Without Winnie, there would be no Nelson Mandela, as the world remembers him. Because while he was locked away, it was she who carried his name. She who turned him from a prisoner into a legend. She who refused to let South Africa forget Mandela's name. Winnie Madikizela-Mandela was not a saint, and we will all agree with that by the end of today's conversation. She was not flawless. This woman was fire, and fire, whether it warms or burns, can never be ignored. So why did many people see Winnie as the hero? We are going to get to that, but before we do, allow me to say thank you so much for the feedback you've been giving us on our previous episodes. Our conversation on Mahatma Gandhi shocked majority of you, but it has also taught us a very important lesson, that we must always question the facts that some people would want us to believe. And I'm going to have one of our top researchers, EJ, will join me at the end of this conversation so that we can be able to also comment on why these conversations are very, very important to us. But now, let's go back to Winnie Mandela's story. Because before she met Nelson, she was already a force in the making. She was born Nomzamo Winfred Zanyiwe Madikizela on 26 September 1936 in the rural village of Bizana in Pondoland, Eastern Cape. Now, the name Nomzano is Xhosa, which means she who strives or undergoes trials, and almost prophetically, as we will see on today's conversation, her life would become exactly that. Now, she grew up in a deeply traditional Xhosa family. Her father, Columbus Madikizela, was a history teacher and later became a local chief. Her mother, Gertrude, was a domestic science teacher. They were educated, but this did not mean her childhood was easy. Winnie was the fourth of 8 children, and tragedy struck early. When she was only 9 years old, her mother died, forcing her to step into the adulthood sooner than most children. Winnie's awakening to the cruelty of apartheid came early. In 1945, she was just 9 years old when the Second World War ended. The town of Bizana buzzed with excitement. There were celebrations at the local hall. Winnie and her siblings, you can imagine, begged their father to take them, and at last he agreed. But when they arrived to where the celebrations were, the door was shut to them. The celebration was for white people only. She and her siblings were left standing outside while the white folks rejoiced inside. That sting of exclusion stayed with her. From that moment, the injustice of the system was no longer abstract. It was definitely personal, and it sharpened her awareness of the world she was growing up to. Now, despite the hardships, Winnie's brilliance in school was undeniable. By 1955, she had completed her social work diploma at the Jan Homfire School of Social Work, finishing all the way at the top of her class. This woman's performance was so exceptional that she was offered a scholarship to study further in the United States. It was a door to a world of opportunity. But almost at the same time, she was offered a position at Baragwanath Hospital in Joburg. Now, this was the first time a Black South African would be appointed as a medical social worker. She faced a difficult choice, you can imagine. Do I leave for America to study, or do I stay and serve my people? Winnie chose to stay. It was a defining decision. It showed where her heart was and where her heart lay, with her people. And definitely, she was right there to go through the daily struggles the people endured and not go to America to study. In the hospital, she would witness firsthand the daily suffering of Black families under apartheid. We are talking about malnutrition, poverty, past laws that broke families apart. Children were dying of preventable diseases, and this would shape her political consciousness long before even her marriage. Winnie once said that in the hospital, she saw the humiliations of apartheid etched on people's faces. Now, those experiences hardened her resolve. She was not yet the fiery public figure we remember, but that seed of resistance was being planted in her those years. Now, by the time she met Nelson Mandela in 1957, she was already an educated professional Black woman who stood out in apartheid South Africa. She wasn't merely the wife of Mandela. She had her own path, her own identity, and her own pain that would definitely fuel her activism. Now, when Winnie met Nelson Mandela in 1957, she was just 22 and working as a social worker at Baragwanath Hospital. Nelson was 18 years older, already a prominent lawyer in Joburg and a rising star in the ANC. At the time, he was still married to Evelyn Massi, but that marriage was crumbling. Now, the story of Winnie and Mandela goes like this from their own words. They met at a bus stop in Soweto. Mandela was instantly struck by her beauty and presence. For Winnie, meeting Mandela was like meeting living history. He was already a known activist admired for his courage. So you can imagine when he stopped Winnie, Winnie was like, oh my God, you know, their courtship was intense, almost cinematic. Mandela wooed her with his charm, intellect, and charisma. Winnie, young and ambitious, was drawn into his world of politics, the speeches and the gatherings, you know. They married in June 1958, just a year after meeting, in a traditional ceremony in Bizana. But their marriage was never a conventional love story. From the very beginning, politics and struggle were at the center of their relationship. In fact, within months of their wedding, Winnie was arrested during the 1958 anti-pass law demonstrations in Joburg, when heavily pregnant with their first child. Definitely this set the tone for their love life. The love life was intertwined with sacrifice, prison, and constant separation. They had two daughters together, Zenani, who was born in 1959, and Zinzi, who was born in 1960. For Winnie, motherhood was never just about family. It was about raising children under siege with the constant harassment from the police. And definitely, before we go any deeper on their love life during apartheid, let's talk about someone we mentioned that I think we are about to forget, but we will not, because she's always the most forgotten person when it comes to this story. Evelyn Massi, who we said was Mandela's first wife. Now, Evelyn Massi was a nurse, and interestingly, she was the cousin of Walter Sisulu. You guys remember Walter Sisulu, one of Mandela's closest comrades in the struggle. Evelyn and Mandela married in 1944, just as he was beginning his political career with the ANC Youth League. They had 4 children together. They had Tembi, who was born in 1946, but tragically killed in a car accident in 1969 while Mandela was in prison. Then they had Makaziwe the first, born in 1947, who died at 9 months. Then they had Makato, who was born in 1950, later became a lawyer, but died of AIDS-related illness in 2005. And then they now had Makaziwe the second, named after Makaziwe the first, born in 1954. And this is the only one of their children who is still surviving and who is still alive today. Now, at first, their marriage seemed stable. Mandela was a young lawyer, Evelyn a nurse. raising children in Soweto. But cracks began to show as Mandela's political life intensified. Evelyn was deeply religious, a strong Jehovah's Witness member, and preferred a quieter life, more family-oriented life. She didn't share Mandela's passion for politics, and she disapproved of his long absences, the late nights, and growing involvement in the ANC. By the early 1950s, their marriage was in trouble. Mandela later admitted in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, that he was not the most faithful husband and that his obsession with politics strained their home. Evelyn accused him of neglect and infidelity. By 1956, they were separated, and in 1958, the same year Mandela married Winnie, they officially divorced. After the divorce, Evelyn lived a much quieter life, raising their children mostly on her own. She never sought the spotlight, even after Mandela became a global icon, and later in life she ran a grocery store in Orlando, Soweto, and largely stayed out of politics. She died in 2004 and is buried in Soweto. And the reason I brought in Evelyn is because Evelyn was a huge part of Mandela's foundation. She had been there all along when this man, was dying of the activism, when this man was confident that, we are going to fight for the people. And this is the woman who was there all along and the woman who they created their first family with. So it's very important for us to be able to also shine a spot on her so that when we tell this story, we are not trying to also put her in the shadow the way majority of history works have done, right? And generally, there's usually mixed feelings when it comes to Mandela's love triangle, and we will definitely get to that later. Now, let's come back to apartheid, because it wasn't just racism in the abstract, it was a legal system built to control Black lives at every level. Introduced officially in 1948 by the National Party, apartheid divided South Africans into rigid racial categories. You had the white people, the black, colored, and then you had Indians. There were pass laws that forced Black people to carry identification documents to move around the cities. Being caught without a pass meant arrest, fines, or even jails, and families were torn apart just by this law. Then there were the Land Acts that restricted Black people to reserves, later called the homelands, which made up less than 15% of the land, even though they were the majority of population. So you can imagine being put into just 15% of the land, yet you are the majority of that population. Familiar? Yeah, conservancies are owned by just one family. Now, education was deliberately limited. Now, the 1953 Bantu Education Act made sure Black children were trained only for manual labor. Hendrix Verwoerd, one of apartheid's architects, said there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. Oof. Then you had everyday life, from buses, beaches, hospitals, and even benches, was segregated by law. It was a police state. Anyone who resisted risked arrest, burning, torture, or even worse. Now, Nelson Mandela, along with Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and others, formed part of the ANC Youth League. They were pushing for more radical resistance in the 1940s. In the 1950s, Mandela helped organize the Defiance Campaign, the mass civil disobedience against unjust laws, and in 1955, the ANC and allies drafted the Freedom Charter, declaring South Africa belongs to all who live in it, Black and white. The apartheid state responded with increasing violence. The turning point was Sharperville, 1960, when police opened fire on peaceful protesters against pass law, killing 69 people. After this, the ANC was banned. And even if ANC was banned, Mandela and others concluded that peaceful protest alone was not enough. In 1961, they formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of ANC, to sabotage government's infrastructure, not targeting civilians, but railway lines, power plants, and symbols of apartheid. Mandela went underground, earning the name the Black Pimpernel, but in August 1962, he was arrested after returning from a trip abroad. Many believe the CIA tipped off the apartheid police and then led to his arrest. Now, this is the first time we are seeing him sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. Then in 1963, police raided a farm in Rivonia, Joburg, and found documents linking him and others to controversies sabotage plans. Now, this led to the famous Rivonia trial of 1963 to 1964. In court, Mandela delivered his legendary speech ending with, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But, my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." I'm sure you've seen that quote a couple of times. He and 7 others were sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a maximum security prison of Cape Town. When Nelson Mandela was taken away in 1964 and sent to this prison for life, the government thought they had buried him in silence. But that silence quickly became Winnie's battleground. She became the public face of Mandela family, the one journalists would turn to when Mandela could not speak for himself in prison. The rules of this prison were made to hurt, not just to separate. The rules were so stringent that he was not allowed to communicate or see his family. The only time he was able to was in June 1963, where Winnie was made to travel 1,400 kilometers from Joburg to Cape Town only to see him for 30 minutes. Torture us, please. Torture, torture. That was pure torture. Even when Mandela tried writing letters, they were often torn apart by censors. Whole sentences were blacked out with ink. So Winnie would receive a letter filled with broken thoughts and missing pieces. You know, when they say these files are classified and then they make sure they black out certain parts, yeah, those were the kind of letters that Winnie would definitely receive. For the children, Zenani and Zinzi, it was even worse. Prison rules said children could not visit their fathers until they were 16. That meant they spent most of their childhoods knowing their dad only through scraps of censored letters and stories their mother told them about him. This was not an accident. The government designed it this way to make sure the bond between Mandela and his family would weaken, to make the girls see their father as more of a shadow than a man. But instead of breaking them, it forced Winnie to step into the fire. She became both the mother and the father to the girls, the only living bridge between her husband in prison and the world outside. The state hoped silence would destroy their love. Instead, it taught Winnie how to fight with nothing but fragments and how to carry her family when the system tried to erase it. Winnie's house in Orlando West became a place the police treated like their own. They did not need a reason to knock. They came whenever they wanted. Sometimes it was midnight, sometimes it was morning with boots kicking the doors. Other times, they would just come whenever they wanted, even when children were just waking up, and officers would storm inside demanding answers, dragging Winnie away for questioning, and then dropping her back hours or days later. On top of that came something called a banning order. It sounds harmless, but it was one of the most cruel tools of apartheid. Now, a banning order turned a person into what the law called a non-person. That meant Winnie could not attend public meetings, she could not be quoted in any newspaper, and she was not even allowed to speak to more than one person at a time. Imagine living like that. You are alive, standing in your own house, but legally you are meant to be silent, invisible, untouchable, na hata utembelewe. This was the government's way of choking her without laying a hand on her. They did not just want to punish her, they wanted to erase her voice, to make her present but very powerless. But every time they came through that door, every time they tried to lock her in silence, Winnie found another way to remind the world she was still there. On May 12, 1969, the police came for Winnie again. This time, they used something called the Terrorism Act of 1967. It was one of the most frightening laws in South Africa. Under it, the police could arrest anyone they claimed had information and keep them locked up forever without even taking them to court. No trial, no lawyer, no end date, nothing. And that is exactly what they did to Winnie. They took her to Pretoria Central Prison, shut the door, and left her there. She would spend the next 491 days in detention, most of them in solitary confinement. That meant 4 walls, a hard floor, and silence, and maybe no washroom, no bucket, no nothing, no human touch, no family visits, no sound, but her own breathing, Her in this prison and Mandela in Robben Island meant that the children were now orphaned by the system. They were looked after by relatives and friends, particularly Winnie's younger sister and members of the extended Madikizela family. In her diary, later published as 491 Days, prisoner number 1323/69, Winnie described how time itself began to melt, days and nights blurred together. She was pulled out for long, harsh interrogations where officers tried to break her mind, shouting, threatening, demanding, etc., etc. They were demanding for names. She was left so alone that she started talking to cockroaches in her own cell, just to remember what it felt like to have a conversation. And you guys, you've seen this in movies where they pick a prisoner from the main cell and then they take them to a solitary confinement, and then they make sure that the room is so ugly and it's so dark, and sometimes they let you have a bit of a ray of light, and they now come and take you and they go and they beat you up and they're interrogating you, and they're even that thing, you know what I'm talking about. So you can imagine Winnie going through that, and then maybe there are cockroaches passing by and she starts like, hey Mandela, sometimes maybe she labeled a cockroach, just names, or just call this cockroach Beatrice or Lynn, and just, I don't know. It must have been a tough time for her, just being in that place and knowing that her children, they don't have their father, and now they've taken their mother. But when she finally walked out in 1970, she was not the same woman. She was thinner, she was exhausted, she was scarred by sleepless nights and constant fear. But she was also sharper and harder. Prison had stripped away her private life and left only the fighter. Winnie herself said that after those months, her personal self no longer existed. What remained was her political self, a woman who had become a living symbol of resistance. As we will see in the mid-1970s, where South Africa was like dry grass waiting for a match. The government's education system for black children, called Bantu education, was designed to keep them down. It gave them poor facilities, underpaid teachers, and a curriculum meant to prepare them only for labor, as we said, never for leadership. Then came a new rule. In schools, half the subjects had to be taught in Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor. Can you imagine? So now you want me to be a labor. Oh, I get maybe why. Because they were being trained for labor. So they need them to talk to their bosses in a language that belongs to them. Now, for the children of Soweto, that was the breaking point. On the morning of June 16, 1976, thousands of school children, some as young as 12, marched peacefully through the streets, singing freedom songs and holding placards. But the police, they did what they do best. They opened fire. Within hours, bodies lay on the ground. One of the first was Hector Pitson, just 13-year-old. His body carried through the streets in a photograph that shocked the world. Winnie was there in Soweto. She was not just the wife of a prisoner anymore. She had become a mother figure to the community. She went ahead and started helping parents organize funerals for these children. She comforted mothers who had lost these children, and she stood by young people who were now ready to fight back. She worked alongside leaders like Dr. Tato Motlana to form what became known as Black Parents Association, which gave structure to the anger and grief pouring through the townships. For the government, they looked at her and they saw a very dangerous person. She was no longer just carrying Mandela's name. She was now a leader in her own right, walking side by side with the youth and their mothers and their parents, and her presence told these children that they were not alone, that someone was watching over them, even as the state tried to crush them. The Soweto uprising did not end that day. It spread like wildfire across South Africa, and Winnie became tied to that flame. Her voice, her courage, and her defiance gave the uprising a face that the world could see. And with every funeral she attended, every rally she spoke at, she was carrying her own place in the struggle, not behind Mandela, but beside him in her own lane. By 1977, Winnie had become too visible and too dangerous for the apartheid state to ignore. She was not only Mandela's wife anymore. She was the woman standing in front of angry children, the one comforting grieving parents, the one daring to speak when others had been silenced. To the regime, she was a spark that could light up the whole township. So, in May 1977, they tried something new. Instead of jailing her again, they decided to bury her alive in her own country. They sent her and her children into banishment. Now, banishment is a cruel form of exile where you are removed from your home and forced to live in a faraway place, cut off from your community. She was sent to that small dusty town in the Free State called Brandfort, where the government gave her a tiny broken down house, number 802. That house had no electricity, no running water, no proper floors or even ceilings. It was not a home, it was a cage. Most of the people there spoke Sesotho or Afrikaans, not her home language Xhosa. It was deliberately designed to make her an outsider, to cut her off from her roots and to isolate her so completely that the world saw her as irrelevant, or she became irrelevant. But Winnie did not disappear. This woman was very strong. Instead, she transformed Brandfort into another stage of resistance. She opened an early learning center for children, because even in exile, she wanted to educate and protect the young. She worked with Dr. Abubakar Asvat, a compassionate doctor in Soweto, who often traveled to support her efforts, and together they started a small clinic. She also connected with Operation Hunger, an organization that helped feed starving families in rural areas. So I'm imagining people are looking at her and they're like, we have banished you. You are supposed to be relevant, woman. You go on and start early childhood centers. You go on and open clinics. You are here talking and catering to the community. Of course, the people at Brandfort, who at first saw her as a stranger, began to recognize her strength. They watched this woman, banished and monitored day and night by police, still wake up every morning to build something for the community. Twice, her little house was bombed, but Winnie refused to leave. She would repair what she could and continue with life. What the government meant as punishment, Winnie turned it into purpose. Brandfort was supposed to silence her. Instead, it added another layer to her legacy. She showed that even when stripped of comfort, surrounded by poverty, and far from the spotlight, she could still fight, still serve, and still stand with the people. By the early 1980s, the regime's plan to bury Winnie in Brandfort was failing. The world still spoke of her name. Journalists found their way to that dusty township, and photographs of her broken house number 802 became symbols of apartheid's cruelty. You can imagine the whole world looking at where Nelson Mandela's wife is living. This is what the government is doing to Winnie Mandela. You can imagine how the entire world was reacting. And guys, this is not 1902, this is 1980s, when majority of African countries had attained independence, right? And within the community, she had turned exile into service. Instead of Winnie vanishing, she had built the learning center, the clinic, and food programs. Brandfort had not silenced her. If anything, Brandfort sharpened her. By 1985, restrictions began to ease, and Winnie slowly made her way back into the heart of Soweto. But this was not the Soweto she had left behind. The township was on fire. Protests had spread across the country. The youths were rising in anger, funerals turned into political rallies, and the apartheid government was losing its grip. It was in this climate that Winnie stood taller than ever. In February of 1985, Winnie stood with her daughter Zinzi Mandela as a defiant and protective figure at the Jambulani Stadium in Soweto. In her daughter's hand was her father's reply to President P.W. Botha's offer of conditional release. Before thousands, she read his words: Mandela would not leave prison unless all South Africans were free. The crowd erupted, but the moment was about more than the letter. It was about Winnie's presence, about a family that the state had tried to erase, now standing publicly, defiantly, alive, and saying, "We are still here." The years of banishment and constant harassment had obviously changed Winnie. Her tone became harder, her fire less forgiving, and in April 1986, at a rally in Moonsville, she made the statement that would follow her forever.
We have stones, we have boxes of matches. With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
Yeah, where she's saying, with our boxes and matches and our necklaces. Necklace is figurative. Some people say it meant tires around the neck. We shall liberate this country. She was speaking in a time when the townships were crawling with spies and informers, when neighbors suspected neighbors, and when betrayal meant death. For some, her words captured the raw anger of the people, but to others, they crossed a moral line, appearing to endorse a brutal form of punishment, because again, when she says our necklaces and necklacing, meant, burning people with tires around their neck. Yeah, some people thought, nah, this woman is cray-cray. And that left deep scars on the struggle. Her Orlando West home was no longer now just a family house. It had turned into a stronghold. Around her gathered a group of young men who called themselves the Mandela United Football Club. On the surface, they were just a soccer team. In reality, they acted as Winnie's bodyguards. But in a township poisoned by spies and informers and constant raids, these young men became more than protectors. They were also feared. Soweto was a place where suspicion could kill. Neighbors turned on neighbors if they thought someone was working with the police. Violence crept into daily life, and Winnie's football club was caught up in all of it. By 1988, clashes broke out between the group and students in the community. And one night, her house was even set on fire, a sign that many people in Soweto were turning against the very name they once called Mother of the Nation. Then came the tragedy that would haunt her legacy forever. In December 1988, 4 young boys were taken by members of the football club and brought to her house. Among them was Stompy, just 14-year-old. He was a child, still in school, still forming dreams. But in those days, being accused of being a police informer, as I said, was almost a death sentence. Fear spread faster than facts, and once the football club believed he was a spy, his fate was sealed. For days, these boys were held in Winnie's yard, watched and beaten by the men she trusted. Stompy's small body took the brunt of it, and then, not long after, his life was gone. His body was found dumped, battered, and broken. The discovery shocked the community. And for the first time, the name Winnie Mandela was not only spoken with reverence and respect, but also with whispers of fear and betrayal. The woman who had carried her husband's name through decades of struggle was now tied to the murder of a child. And you can imagine, from here onwards, things would definitely go south for Winnie. But before we continue with Winnie's part, let's talk about the morning of February 11, 1990. Because this day, the world stood still. After 27 years behind bars, Nelson Mandela walked free. You had crowds filling the streets of Cape Town, the cameras rolling, and millions watching around the globe. And beside him, holding his hand, was Winnie Mandela. For many people, that image was the fulfillment of a dream. The man who had become a myth was finally alive in front of them. And the woman who had carried his name all those years was right there by his side. They had been apart for nearly 3 decades, but to the cheering crowds, it looked like love had won and survived. You know, this was a love untouched by time. The raised fists, the smile, the walk out of Victor Vesta prison, people saw it as a symbol of victory, not just for South Africa, but for the human spirit. But behind the cameras, things were far more complicated. But bear with me, we shall get to the complication. Let's progress for now. Winnie had lived a very different 27 years. She had faced raids, bans, solitary confinements, banishments, and the daily war of the townships. She had seen children shot in the streets, seen them buried. She also buried comrades and had been branded a criminal in the courts. She had become fierce, uncompromising, very radical. She was still full of fire. To Winnie, the struggle was not over. It was still war. So when they stood side by side in 1990, what we saw was unity. But privately, there was distance. Mandela himself admitted later that he had missed out on his daughter's childhoods, and the long separation had carved a gap in their marriage that no public hand-holding could definitely repair. Winnie, for her part, had learned to live without him, to become her own leader, to build her own power. Their love, which had once been young and fairy, had been stretched and scarred by time, by absence, by the struggle, and also by betrayal. At first, they tried to hold on to each other, to the image. Winnie traveled with Mandela, appeared at rallies, stood as his partner in history, but soon cracks began to show. The whispers of the Stompy case still followed her. You remember when we said Mandela is coming out of prison, but life would never be the same for Winnie? Within the ANC, there were leaders who wanted to distance Mandela from her controversies. And in private, the two of them realized they had grown into very different people. One molded by the discipline of prison, and the other by the chaos of the streets. Their reunion in 1990 was powerful, unforgettable, and even historic, but it was also fragile. What the cameras captured was real. This was a symbol of survival and resilience. But what the cameras could not show was the truth, that the years apart had changed them so deeply that they could never go back to the way it was. But Mandela's release did not wash away the storm around Winnie. In fact, in many ways, it made the storm even more visible, because as Nelson returned, polished by the discipline of prison, ready to negotiate with the apartheid government, Winnie returned to the global stage, still carrying the weight of the Stompy scandal. The case had not disappeared. If anything, Mandela's release threw more light on it. The mother of the nation was now being asked hard questions, not about her sacrifices, but about her responsibility in the death of a 14-year-old boy. Her trial began shortly in 1991, barely a year after Mandela's release. The timing could not have been more difficult. On one hand, the world wanted to celebrate South Africa's journey towards freedom. On the other, it was forced to watch Winnie Mandela, the wife of the liberation icon, standing in court as a criminal accused. Now, for Mandela himself, this was painful. He stood by her at first, appearing at her side, but the strain was visible. The press painted the trial as a test not only of Winnie, but of the ANC's moral standing. The court found her guilty of kidnapping and assault, sentencing her to 6 years in prison. It was a shocking fall, but almost immediately she appealed, and on appeal, the assault conviction was overturned, and her sentence was cut down to a fine and a 2-year suspended sentence. This meant she did not serve prison time. And here is where Mandela's release mattered. His freedom gave Winnie both protection and exposure. Protection because the ANC and Mandela himself did not want her publicly humiliated during such a sensitive political movement or moment. They were negotiating the end of apartheid, and they needed unity. Then it also gave her exposure because the world now scrutinized her more closely than ever. Every move she made was tied to Nelson's name, every controversy magnified into sharper focus. His presence did not ease the weight of Stompy, it only made it heavier because the world now expected her to be as untouchable as Mandela. And she could never be. The personal wounds were just as deep. Rumors also came up of Winnie's affairs during Nelson's imprisonment. There were whispers that cut at the very image of a loyal wife waiting for her husband to return. And the most persistent claims tied her to Darling Pofu, a young lawyer in the ANC who was once her protege. Some reports also linked her to other comrades in the movement, though nothing was ever proven in court. Mandela himself, dignified as always, never spoke publicly in detail, but those people who were close to this man said that these rumors hurt him a lot. For a man who had carried her memory like a torch through 27 years in isolation, the idea that she had not waited faithfully was definitely a blow to Mandela. By 1992, the strain between them was no longer just political, it was personal. Nelson Mandela wanted reconciliation, careful negotiations, and healing. And this is where, to some people, it gets messy. One of the most debated issues in post-apartheid South Africa is whether Mandela compromised too much with the white establishment. Winnie and other radicals believed so. Mandela did not push for land redistribution to this day. The most arable land remains in white hands, and instead of dismantling the economic power of the white minority, Mandela's government preserved much of it, as well as the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission. They prioritized peace over punishment, meaning perpetrators of apartheid crimes were granted amnesty without reparations. Now, for Winnie, this was evidence that Mandela had become a sellout, becoming a symbol of white appeasement rather than black liberation. Winnie, hardened by the brutality of the streets, still believed in fire. She still believed the struggle was far from over. And that year, in 1992, Mandela announced that he and Winnie had separated. In 1996, they officially divorced. It was one of the most public divorces in South African history, played out in newspapers and courtrooms. Nelson remained diplomatic, never attacking her publicly, but the world could see that their love, once forged in fire, had been consumed by it. Yet Winnie did not even disappear after the divorce. She remained in politics, became the head of the ANC Women's League, and some people ask, why did she join a government that she did not believe in? It's because she believed change could only happen from inside. By accepting positions in Mandela's government, Winnie thought she could remain close to the levers of power, represent the township, the poor, and pressure the ANC leadership from within. She later served as Deputy Minister of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology in Mandela's new government, but her career was always shadowed by the same contradictions. A fearless leader, loved in the townships, distrusted in the corridors of power, admired and condemned in equal measure. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Winnie's battles shifted from the police cells of apartheid to the courtrooms of a free South Africa. In 2003, she was convicted of fraud and theft. The case involved her role in a bank loan scheme connected to the ANC's Women's League. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but on appeal, the conviction was reduced to fraud alone and her sentence was suspended again. She did not serve time, but once again, the headlines were brutal. To her critics, this was proof that she was reckless and unfit for leadership. To her supporters, it was another attempt by the establishment, this time the democratic government, to silence a woman who spoke too boldly and refused to play by the rules of respectability. Inside the ANC, her relationship with the leadership was uneasy. She had influence, especially through the Women's League and her support in the grassroots, but she was also seen as unpredictable, sometimes embarrassing to the party. Still, when elections came, the ANC often called on her to campaign. Why? Because in the townships, among the poor, she was adored. People called her Mam Winnie. They remembered the woman who had faced police dogs, who had been banished, who had built learning centers and clinics in Brandfort, who had walked behind the coffins of school children. They did not care about corruption, charges, or any other scandal. To them, Winnie was still theirs. Winnie also never stopped speaking her mind. She criticized the ANC leadership for being too soft, for being too close to business, for betraying the poor. Even Nelson Mandela himself was not spared. At times, she suggested that he had been turned into a saintly figure to soothe white fears, while she remained the true uncompromising revolutionary. Her words often stung, but they also rang true for many who felt left behind in the new South Africa. And as she grew older, Winnie became a kind of paradox. The state treated her with suspicion. The ANC leadership often kept her at arm's length, but the people, the ones in the townships, the women in the markets, the youths in the streets still chanted her name. At rallies, her presence could still electrify a crowd. Even when scandals piled up, her funeral attendances, her township walkabouts, her fiery speeches reminded everyone why she was called the mother of the nation. When Nelson Mandela died on December 5th, 2013, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Cameras gathered outside his home in Joburg. His family sat quietly. Winnie was there. Graça Machel, his wife at the time, was there too. And for years, these two women had been painted as rivals. That's a completely different story from today. You can be able to check it out, Winnie versus Graça Machel. But in that moment of grief, these two women embraced. At the memorial in Soweto's FNB Stadium, when the crowd spotted Winnie, they began chanting her name. Winnie, Winnie, Winnie. It was just Winnie, 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 Winnie. It was a reminder that even though their marriage had ended almost 2 decades earlier, South Africans had not forgotten who had carried Mandela's name during his darkest years. By then, Mandela had long remarried. In 1998, to take you back, on his 80th birthday, he had wed Graça Machel, the widow of Mozambique President Samora Machel. Now, following Mandela's death, when his will was read, it reflected this reality. The estate, worth 46 million rands, was divided among Graça, his children, grandchildren, and even his household staff. Winnie's name was not in the will, because she was an ex-wife-in-law, though never in the memory, but yeah, she was an ex-wife. Now, instead, Winnie went to court to claim ownership of Kunu, Mandela's ancestral village and final resting place, arguing that it had been given to her under customary law. But in 2016 and in 2018, the courts dismissed her claim. Legally, she lost, but in the hearts of many, the very act of fighting showed that she still considered herself bound to him, tied not just by law or paper, but by history. Through all this, Winnie remained composed in public. She mourned Madiba as the father of the nation, attended the ceremonies, and gave interviews recalling his final hours. But those who watched closely could see the distance. Mandela had become sainted in death, his flaws polished away by tributes and monuments. Winnie, by contrast, remained as she had always been, loved and loathed, honored and criticized, never allowed the same soft edges. People saw Winnie for who she was: betrayer, resistor, revolutionary, hard-headed, all those things. That's what everyone saw. But in April 2018, South Africa received the news it had long feared.
We begin with breaking news out of South Africa and the death of anti-apartheid icon Winnie Madikizela-Mandela.
Winnie Mandela was 81. Her personal assistant confirming she had been suffering from an infection.
Winnie Madikizela-Mandela had died at Netcare Mill Park Hospital in Joburg. The family said it was after a long illness. Reports spoke of repeated hospital admissions that year, most recently for a kidney infection. She was 81 years old, and just like that, one of the fiercest voices of the struggle was gone. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The government declared a special official funeral in Soweto. Thousands poured into the Orlando Stadium, filling it with songs of remembrance. Former comrades, presidents, bishops, and ordinary South Africans all stood to pay tribute. President Cyril Ramaphosa called her a voice of defiance, a voice for the voiceless. In the stadium, the people remembered her not as a saint, but as their own mom, Winnie, the woman who had never left their side, even when the world turned against her. When her coffin was carried out, draped in the South African flag, there was a kind of reckoning in the air. For decades, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela had been both celebrated and condemned, but in death, South Africa paused, not to erase the shadows, not to erase her crimes, but to acknowledge the fire. She had carried Mandela's name when the state tried to bury it. She had stood when they tried to silence her. She had lived unapologetically, even when it cost her everything. And that is how South Africa said goodbye to Winnie, not to a saint, not to a flawless heroine, but to a woman forged in extraordinary violence, who fought with extraordinary fire, who could never be erased, loved, hated, respected, feared. Winnie Madikizela-Mandela was all of this, and above all, she was unforgettable. Now, tell me, what do you think? Who was the hero here? Was the hero Nelson Mandela, or was the hero Winnie Madikizela-Mandela? Or does it even matter who the hero in this case was? I'm about to bring one of our top researchers at LNN, EJ. You guys, you've seen EJ before. He hosts a couple of shows here, and he will be also hosting some of these thought-provoking history conversations so that he can be able to tell me what his thoughts are. Who is the hero in all this? EJ. Hi.
I'm doing well.
How are you feeling today?
I'm okay.
Yeah, I know it's been an intensive week, just trying to put a few things together when it comes to Winnie and Nelson Mandela. What are your overall thoughts, and how has the process been like for you?
The process has been a lot,
Yes.
because you have to go in depth and doing the research and the analysis on everything. But this story of Nelson and Winnie, I can say it's more of a story that happens in Africa many of the times. And as much as we say that history has been distorted,
Yes.
sometimes history has been marinated, has been edited, has been made soft to make some people look good and others look bad.
Yeah.
I can say in this story, I feel like Winnie never got the credit she deserved. She was on the ground, she was on the street. And as you said earlier, there could not be Nelson without Winnie.
Yes.
So I feel the country, maybe not the country itself, but the system in South Africa, never gave her the credit that she deserved.
Okay.
She did so much work, but they never appreciated her as much. And there's a question I was asking. I don't know why in Africa we have this thing of, sometimes in these liberations, we wait for someone who is maybe away, maybe who is locked up, who is sentenced, instead of looking of people who are on the ground, people who have been doing the true fighting.
All right.
Yeah, so I feel like Winnie did get the credit that she deserves for the liberation in South Africa.
All right.
Yeah.
I definitely share the same sentiments, but I'm waiting to see what our audience are going to say on the comment section.
Okay.
But another one that really shocked us was Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
That was really, for me, even when I was telling our audience how I used to be so happy. I celebrate a birthday because he's born October 2nd. I'm born October 2nd.
Yeah.
And for me, I always said it as a flex. You know, I share a birthday with Mahatma Gandhi. But now we are looking at it and we are like, we've been lied to our entire life to view this man as a hero when he was a collaborator. How was that like for you, Mahatmas?
Exactly. I don't know. This is what you can say, what you are not taught in school or what history never taught us. But that was mind-blowing for me. For me, I also grew up knowing Mahatma was the hero.
Yes.
I used to see him in, I think, in social studies and history books.
Yeah.
With his image there, you knew this man was a hero. He made great decisions. But we never never knew the story behind it and how he treated Africans, and also even on his private life, as the stories on celibacy and all that.
Yeah.
So that was like an awakening call and all that. I was so shocked because I never expected that from Mahatma. But now it's what we say, was he also trying to bring out an inferiority complex?
Yes.
Because of what he did, he might have said he was fighting for the rights of the Asians and the Indians, but he still showed that he still believed that the whites and the Caucasians were still above him. So I feel like he also had an inferiority complex.
Yes.
He didn't believe in himself and also his race and all that.
Yeah.
And that's why he needed to bridge that gap between the whites and the Asians and the black people.
Okay.
But that was mind-blowing.
That was it.
I don't know what we have been taught in our school, but it also tells us about how our education system, not even in Africa, our education system is so distorted, and they just have to bring a certain narrative.
Yeah.
They have to paint some
that
people.
fits a certain perception,
Yeah,
and paint some people as angels, you know?
Thank you, yeah. So I feel like our education system is so distorted, and we have to go back to our history books. We have to go back to do our own research and know what really happened. Who were these people? Were they as good as we were taught, and were they as bad as we were taught?
Yeah.
For the case of Winnie Mandela.
Winnie Mandela.
Yeah.
Another one, maybe before I let you go, because our audience will definitely be seeing you tackling some of these conversations, sitting here on this same table, was the psychology of color. I remember when we were working on when we were researching on black and white Jesus, one of the things that we were really keen on making sure that we communicate to our audience was the psychology of color, and how black has been used to, what is it called? It's been used to project as if it's a bad thing, and white is always perceived as the most peaceful color.
Exactly.
When you brought that to my attention, I was actually like, wait a minute, what is this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just about programming of the brain, and our brains have been programmed to always see white is pure, white is good, then black is evil, it's bad. And now you see it comes to us as the people, our skin color matters. The same thing about inferiority complex. We feel like people of a lighter skin tone or people who are white, they are better than us.
Yeah.
They are, all those things. And I think we should also tackle that. One day we tackle that conversation of how they tried to bring up this conversation of trying to say white people have a higher IQ than black people. I don't know where that came from.
I really want to get deeper into that.
Because I don't think, do you think black people are stupid or anything?
Why I wouldn't even dare think that. Look at us, intelligent.
Yeah,
Look at us.
Yeah, like,
very, very intelligent.
Yeah, like black supremacy. We have always
we've always been the prize, you know.
Yeah, so that it's so bad because it has been into us. I've seen kids. Let me just use my niece.
Yes.
I'm walking with my niece on the streets.
Yeah.
And she sees a white man with long hair and she tells me that is Jesus. It's not even about even the paintings on the wall.
Yes.
That thing, because of how we have been programmed, how our minds have been programmed to see something. So yeah, about color and the psychology of color, it's something that we have to look deep into it. Yeah.
Are you excited of these new segments? Do you think this is something that we have to do even before we can go back to our normal programming? Do you think this matters to us?
This is what matters. this is the time. This is the time.
Yeah.
This is where we have to go back and learn the truth.
Yes.
As we said with our theme of learning and
relearning.
And as they say, what? The illiterate person of the 21st century is not what?
It's not
one who cannot read or write.
Yes.
But is one who cannot
learn
and relearn. So it's time to go back and know the truth. I don't know, some kind of conscious awakening.
Yes.
And so many things that have been hidden in plain sight. We have to know the truth. So I'm very excited about us teaching the people, our audience, about history, distorted history, some half truths and full truths. We have to know everything that happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
Light on.
Light
on.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, EJ. Really looking forward to be now the one sitting behind there and seeing you also tackle some of these conversations.
Yeah.
Which one are you looking forward to? Just don't give them everything. Just give them maybe one or two. Which one are you looking forward to presenting?
Okay. I would like to present that one. Okay, that one you've said about the race and IQ.
Yes.
That one is something I would like to tackle.
Yeah.
But I would also like to tackle about how Black people brought civilization in Europe.
Yes.
Way
before.
That one. Because
Okay,
they always say maybe the Europeans are the one who brought civilization in Africa.
Yeah.
But history is distorted.
Yes, and please don't forget to say we even brought the soap around, right?
Yeah.
We are not doing this to flex, but we gotta teach our children.
Yeah.
There's a very huge age gap between me and you. So when I see we are sharing this in common, and there's this thirst for us to want to go deeper and find out the truth for ourselves, makes me really happy. So I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, so that's pretty much it from me and my producer here, EJ. And as I said, I also want to thank the rest of the researchers at LNN. I think everyone at LNN is really excited about these conversations, and we can't wait to see how this turns out. But I really do appreciate you guys. So stay tuned to what EJ will be presenting. We are definitely going to be alternating, but I hope you guys feel the love, and we are doing this because it's time for us to awaken. We can continue bringing conversations on our education system, on some diseases here, how to fight fibroids, etc., etc. But if we do not go to the root cause of how we got here, then believe you me, tunaosha kuku miguu. So thank you so much. Do not forget to support us through our M-Pesa number. It takes a lot, of course, to produce this content. We have our M-Pesa number right there. There's a pay bill number right there as well. And we finally have PayPal. So the guys who are watching this from outside Kenya, and you can be able maybe to use PayPal, please feel free to use it. And also support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing this video to your friends. It goes a long way. Thank you to our team behind the camera. Thank you so much, Muga, Scholar, Joshua, and the rest of the people at LNN, our incredible editors, Wakabi-Sam, our team, business team, Val and Mutange. We really do appreciate you guys. So see you on your next episode.
Next episode.
All right.